Hi, and welcome to part 2 in my 3-part series on FIDO U2F and integration with Citrix Netscaler Gateway. In this part, what I'll do is examine what a typical two-factor implementation looks like using Netscaler with a configuration something like LDAP and RSA, and then show what a transition to FIDO U2F and Duo security would look like. There's a bunch of reasons to use Netscaler Gateway, but for my example today, it will be to protect one security zone from another. A very typical implementation of this, and one of the reasons you would use authentication is to secure your internal network from traffic that originates on the internet. But this could just as easily be, let's say, a non-PCI zone connecting to a PCI zone or vice versa. Given this simple implementation of security, one zone to the next, what I wanted to do is show you kind of what that flow looks like in that scenario. So also in the context of U2F, since it's right now a browser-only technology, the example I'll show you is a receiver for web implementation. In a normal deployment, what you'd see is the untrusted security zone, in this case, the internet, connecting to the trusted zone, your corporate network or your trusted network, across the Netscaler gateway. And in a scenario like this, what you'll see on the web side is a user opens their browser and hits the gateway, and they see a login screen. Again, given the receiver for web implementation, you can see here a username, a password field, and then that second factor. In this implementation, the user types in those credentials, and the first thing that happens is the Netscaler gateway will take those credentials and do that first logon against traditionally the LDAP server, so that's probably Active Directory. And then it does the second factor, and Netscaler is configured to actually use two different factors, first primary and secondary. And those can then later be mapped to policies. But in this case, what we'll say is that second factor is the RSA box, RSA authentication across radius. So in this scenario, the user types in their credentials, they authenticate to LDAP, they authenticate to radius, the Netscaler establishes a session, and then connections to XenApp and XenDesktop are authenticated, and you're off to the races. Things change a little bit in a universal two-factor implementation, especially with Duo security in the mix. So in this case, what will happen, you can see, is the username and password are the only two fields displayed on the gateway in this configuration. This, in this case, is configured for LDAP, so a user would type in their username and their LDAP credentials. And rather than being shuffled directly off to LDAP, the Netscaler is going to leverage Radius and connect to a Duo security provided authentication proxy. This authentication proxy will take those LDAP credentials and validate them against LDAP in this case. It could be Radius as well, but in my configuration, it's LDAP for Active Directory today. Now, assuming that the LDAP credentials are correct, a accept or a valid login will be returned from that LDAP, and the authentication proxy will know about it and then send off a request via the web API to the Duo security mechanism. This mechanism is going to really need that hard token authentication. So rather than asking for just a password, it actually, in this case, returns an iframe, which is really interesting because leveraging the access challenge response from Radius, we're able to actually insert an iframe into your Netscaler gateway authentication mechanism. This is also really important because the U2F specification integrates with the browser, and that iframe code is going to actually ask the user and ask the browser to use their U2F token. Because of this iframe mechanism and the ability for Radius to kind of chain their authentication or chain its authentication, the iframe will prompt the user to press the token. The user will press the token and then send essentially a sideband or out-of-band authentication to the Duo security web API. This will validate the user and then send back that authentication accept or the valid authentication back through the proxy. So in doing so, we're able to facilitate an in-band, an LDAP credential, or we'll call it Radius, whatever, a trusted credential internally with a two-factor, something like U2F, even leveraging a third-party service like Duo security. This is a pretty big change from the primary and secondary factor that I showed before, but at the end of the day, we're still establishing a session on the Netscaler. The Windows credentials are still there, so we can still perform single sign-on. So in this case, we still see the applications in the receiver for web following the two-factor authentication, and then we click on them and we can launch our applications through the gateway. From a Netscaler gateway point of view, there's only a primary factor of authentication. In the prior example, there was a primary and secondary, and in this case, it's just primary. So that's why you only see a username and password field on the gateway. Also, we're relying on a proxy here to do our authentication. So it does kind of bring about the concern or the question of what do we do about high availability and redundancy or global deployments, especially in the case of the enterprise. And then, of course, you might have noticed the proxy does an LDAP or radius request first based on those trusted credentials, and then does the second factor of authentication. This kind of opens up, in my mind, some vulnerabilities for things like denial of service attacks against your Active Directory, or especially if you don't have another intermediary between that authentication proxy and your LDAP infrastructure. Thankfully, we are going through the Netscaler, and we have a lot of ability to create denial of service policies to prevent this sort of thing. We can see how many requests are coming in and make intelligent policy-based decisions about how many requests and who they're coming from and whether we want to allow those people to continue to authenticate against our proxy. So that's all. Just a quick overview of what the architecture and authentication flow looks like. In the next section, I'll actually set it up, and you can watch step by step through every part of the process, from the Netscaler policies to the Duo security front end, all the way to the authentication proxy and configuration of that.